last week by Ben and Amanda. Calvin says that I will not condemn the industry of those who investigate the fuller genealogy, with which Morris tried to do a little bit of. And I will not dissuade the industry of those of the class that want to go after that. But I'm going to take a couple of them here and just, we looked at the big map. We saw where the people were going last week. So you take the mountains of Ararat in eastern Turkey, and you start spreading out from there. You've got Japheth that goes up to Europe. You've got Shem that kind of stays locally. And then you've got Ham and Canaan that spread out. So we see this, they're going out into all the nations and in some sort of fashion. But then you also have Nimrod, who started planting, making a bunch of cities, and he kind of goes straight down the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Fertile Crescent, or the Fertile Crescent, as I was informed that it's actually how you're supposed to pronounce it. Ben corrected me there, so I take that correction. The Fertile Crescent. It's very French, but there you go. I rarely have control of this class, so I lost what little control I did have.
Can you talk about the why before we go any further?
The why?
Yeah, why is this in here? Why do we care? Why do they care?
Because that's...
No, that wasn't supposed to be like sarcastic. I'm serious.
Yes, and I was going to get to that as we get into Shem, but we have, as I mentioned last week, the genealogy that goes from Ham and Japheth, and those go 2 or 3 generations. But what you have for Shem is you've got the full genealogy. It goes down 6 generations. And in the next chapter, what we're going to see is it's going to result in Abraham. So this is the lineage that takes us to Abraham. So when we talk about Abraham, what are we talking about? We're talking about the line that leads to Jesus. And to have some historical context to say, here's his brothers, but here's the line, and here's what goes on here, but here's the rest of the line, to keep that line going and to make sure that we focus on that. That's what's critical about the line of redemption, the line of the line that leads to Christ, and how God operates in his people to bring about the redemption of his people. So that's important, and if it wasn't here, it wouldn't be important. It's not like these are not helpful guides to understand where people groups move. At the end, when we go through all of these nations, all of these peoples, what you have is 70s. This is called the Table of Nations. There's 70 sons that are listed here, and 70 people groups that are listed. 70 is an important number as you go through the rest of redemptive history. That number continues to show up in a number of ways. The 70 that you have 70 elders, you have the number of children of Israel that came into Egypt from Canaan out of Abraham. You've got 70 weeks for Daniel, and so you've got that theme of number, of that number recurring, and it being kind of a special number. Not everyone necessarily is listed here. It's not like Moses is listing all of the sons of these particular guys. These are the important ones. And speculation was that, because Shem is perhaps writing this section, then he records what he can. And then at the death of Noah, when Ham and Japheth come back for the funeral, then he's able to compare notes get some of the genealogy, but obviously it's not gonna continue. That's a very kind of man-centered approach to the genealogy, rather than, what does God have for us? Back to Pete's question. Yeah, no.
This doesn't necessarily provide an answer. It's just an observation that I picked up, I think, from Richard Pratt. He gave a story. After Adam and Eve fall and are cursed, the next story is the birth of their kiddos. After Cain murders Abel, the next story is his kiddos, including Seth and the others. After Noah falls and curses Canaan, is the record of his kiddos. So I'm not making a conclusion, just making an observation that Pratt made. There's a story. Introduce the guy, record his fall, record his cursing, record his kiddos. It just seems to be a narrative tool as well.
Okay.
Not sure what the significance is.
Yeah.
Well, and there's really the driving force is Genesis 3:15, right? There's a promise that the seed of the woman will bruise or crush the head of the serpent, right?
Yeah.
And so he goes down. So there's an intentionality in God bringing it down to one person, Noah, and then out it goes again, and it's brought down to one person, Abraham, and it's not Ishmael, it's Isaac, and it's not Saul, it's David. It's God directing this all the way through to Christ.
Exactly.
It's almost to draw an emphasis on that, in that there are these people groups, but I choose one. And then there's
One person.
Yeah.
And that's amazing. That's
Well, what I was getting at is that this is, I don't know if we know for sure how much data, after being in Egypt for 400 plus years, the people of Israel knew about their lineage. I mean, obviously there was oral tradition and all that kind of stuff, but if we acknowledge the first 5 books that is revealed by God through Moses to the people as they're in the desert, this is your identity. This is who you are. Yes, there's obviously, we can look back and see the historical redemptive thread, and certainly having just been out of the Exodus, that would have been the defining moment for this people group, which in the Psalms and throughout the rest of the Old Testament is constantly going back to, you're the people of the Exodus, you're the people that I bought. There's a lot of identity wrapped up in this. So, but a lot of this is just, hey, these are the people with whom you're going to have to do business with as I take you to the promised land.
Yeah.
So I think we rightly read certain things into it, but we may be inferring more specifics than would have been appropriate for the writer and the audience at the time, in terms of, hey, this is who you are, and these are the people with whom you're going to have to deal. Way back when you all descended from one man.
Both are true.
But he gave way more information than they needed just to get from Egypt to the promised land, right?
Yeah. I mean, these are the groups that they're going to have to battle, like Pete's saying. So where did they come from?
But as a function of identity, it's who you are, right? You're not just this sort of loosely tied grouping of people that I brought out of Egypt.
Yeah,
You are.
that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that, Calvin continues to point back to that purpose of Moses writing specifically to the children of Israel. That's helpful to bring out. Okay, so this is going with Ruth's point that why is it that God interferes in this history, or why did God bring about the flood? Because of the possible destruction of, if he hadn't interfered, of the godly line and of the memory of godly, and how God was working through that line. We have a similar thing that's happening here as we go into chapter 11, that you've got this God acting once again supernaturally in the affairs of men, and with the possibility that, if God had not interfered, then there may have been that end of that line. And so the question, obviously, God nothing takes God off guard, and it isn't like, whoops, I almost lost that or anything like that. But that God does interrupt human history, and but that's kind of akin to what you're saying. But let me backtrack just a little bit. Remember that chapter 10 is written overlapping chapter 11. So then chapter 11 in the Tower of Babel kind of comes right in the middle of the description of the genealogies. And one of them in particular is Peleg. Peleg is the son of Eber, and Eber. What anyone know the connection here? What's so special about Eber? Or should I say Heber? So Eber is the ancestor of all of the Hebrews. So he's going to be that father figure, and so all of the Hebrews will have descended from Eber. And Peleg means divided. His father named him Peleg probably right after what happened, after having found out what happened at the Tower of Babel. So then, as a result of that confusion, then the nations were divided and they were sent out. So that's how Peleg gets his name, and Peleg then becomes one of these figures that his name ends up symbolizing what's actually happening there. Okay, then we, how did the nations, how did they get populated? No one knows. Speculations about being, one continent and then moving out. If it was one continent and then you have this continental movement, there probably would have been something said here, but you also have the ice age that happened right after the flood, that where you have the transmigrations through Asia, and then the land bridge or the ice bridge into North America, and the Indians there. So, and all of that is overlapping stuff that doesn't necessarily make it into the text here. Okay, and these are the clans of the sons of Noah, and we again have our marker as to the division of chapters according to what Moses is writing here. Chapter 11. Anything else on chapter 10? Anybody want to bring up another point there before we dive into? Okay, Ben, 1 through 9, please.
Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth.
Okay. The whole earth had one language and the same words, kind of the same way of saying the same thing. It's not, we say that Great Britain and America are two countries separated by a common language, but some of their words are not the same as our words. So we have one language, but we maybe don't have common words. But the point here is that the capability to have speech means the ability to be able to think abstract thoughts. So a word is a representation. You don't have everything that I am saying here is all representative. I am not saying anything that is concrete as the word is coming out of my mouth. And we all understand that. We communicate because that's the way our brains are hardwired. Even when they go to, they try to Washoe the ape, or, was or a chimp, whatever, a while ago they tried to teach this ape, speech, and they spent all kinds of time to try and get simple sentences out of this chimpanzee, and it weren't going to happen. They ended up forming very, very rudimentary, simple kinds of sentences. But that's it. That's all they got. We have a section in our brain that is predisposed to language. We are made to communicate. So at a cellular level, at a physiological level, you have the part of your brain that understands language, so that God made us to understand language. And this language becomes a unifying factor right here. And we say one of the stories that I remember about language, when the people of New Orleans wanted to know, should we keep our language? Should we go with learning English? And they went up to Canada, and Canada said, with the language goes the culture. And so then the pockets of New Orleans kept the French language because of the heritage that goes with the language. We all understand that as well, that when you start to learn another language, you are also learning another culture. So then if you have one language, you have one culture. You have the opportunity then to always be able to communicate. When you don't have that same language, there will be a natural barrier, not just because the words are different, but because the thought patterns are different and the culture itself is different. So we have a unity in the people at that time. They're going down to Shinar. By the way, it says that they migrated from the east and that they moved into the plain of Shinar. That's right around where Babylon is, and where just south of where Baghdad is, present day, it's back in that Fertile Crescent, Krishna, and where the Tigris and Euphrates kind of come together, and that's where you have that plain, and the plain of Shinar. That's kind of where we're talking about the general location. Okay, so they settled there, and they're going to group together. We've already got the establishment of cities, and they said, come, let us make bricks. What's so special about that? No big deal, except that now we're talking about permanence. We're talking about permanent structures. We're talking about buildings, and burn them thoroughly, indicating that they had not just sun-baked bricks, but they put them in a kiln. When you put them in a kiln and you heat them, they get stronger, and so then that means that you can make a bigger, taller building. The bitumen that some of the translations have, the ESV, that's just asphalt. We know from that whole area that that's where tar pits are. So that's even to this day, they still have lots and lots and lots of oil that would have been on the surface. That's what they're using to put their bricks together to make big, tall buildings. Okay, so this is, there's a bit of unity about the people. They said, let us make bricks. Why is that a big deal? Well, when God, back in Genesis 9, said, fill the earth and subdue it, we say that you have to go out to be able to fill the earth. So now the people are saying that we're going to centralize ourselves. Probably under Nimrod, there was a centralized government. Nimrod was able, because of his reputation, because of the fear that he instilled in the people, he was able to rule and establish a strong central government with the stated purpose of his name to rebel. So he was rebelling against the plan of God. We're going to stay right here, and we're going to do it our own way. There's some indication in the text that when they make this tower, the words that is, some of the translations will say, with a tower that reaches into the heavens, with its tops in the heavens. The ESV is a better way to translate that. There's some implication here that this tower is made as a center of worship, and that we're going to be able to worship God here. Or that may have been the political means by which Nimrod was able to centralize the people there and galvanize their support around a religious endeavor. When we were over in Germany, we saw the castles and the churches that were over there. And these churches were built over many generations. It took, 100 years to build a church. The church in Ulm goes up, way high, and you can still, with the original steps that go up, you can still go up in the bell tower and go up to the top and look out, and quite the edifice. They were able to galvanize that support because they said, we are building our church. And so, see, this is the building. We are building the church. Right there is the building. Not, as Noah continues to emphasize, in us, meaning that wherever we go, there's the church. But here's our building. We're building, therefore we're building the church. And so there's a religious motivation behind that that is possible here. But the words here, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its tops in the heavens. Now all of a sudden we're starting to tread on God's territory, and even though this is something that possibly even like akin to the golden calf could have been something that was dedicated to God, to the true God, nevertheless this isn't the way that God had told them to go about the process. And then you have the key phrase, let us make a name for ourselves rather than for God himself. Our identity is in God. Our identity is in Christ. Our identity is not in ourselves. Now they're trying to separate themselves from that identity in God.
I just, to Pete's point, I was just thinking how this phrase, let us make bricks, must have really smacked the Israelites right in the face, right? Because they had just been making bricks for generations without straw to build an edifice. I mean, they were building a Tower of Babel for the Egyptians. And so this must have meant way more to them than it does to us.
Very, very good. Nice, good point.
Well, the difference between the religious desires, or I say religious, the relationship that God desires with his people versus the religious inclinations of man.
Yes.
So obviously we're speculating whether or not this was to, God, but in the Babylonian religious heritage, the ziggurats were stairs for the gods to come down to them. So we might be putting a little bit too much of a gloss on this, the purpose here, if this was to usher in a descending God to kind of, as they're going up or coming down, either way, they've already forgotten what God has commanded to do, both in Genesis 1 and Genesis 9, which was desired, and now they're doing their own thing. So what God remembers, they have forgotten. So.
Right. And they're operating independently of God, outside of God's plan. Let us make a name for ourselves. I mean, we've got this, we've got Satan in the back, whispering, you can make a name for yourself. How are they going to make a name for themselves? Rather than to be dispersed throughout the world, they're going to make this beautiful edifice that is going to, something that everybody can look to and can behold. Anybody ever been to the Vatican? When you walk into the Vatican, my first impression was I went jaw dropping. I mean, it's like the first time that you see the Grand Canyon. It's spectacular. It's absolutely phenomenal that, back in the 1600s, they were making this edifice, and that is absolutely stunning and beautiful, and but a monument to man. And, did God make it so that this is what we are supposed to do? the impression that's left on me is how much of an appeal that has to me, rather than, you know, this very ill-defined kind of what is it to be the household of God. That's something that's a little bit more distant, a little bit harder to relate to, something that we have to be instructed in. And whenever you ask for money for a church, it's always, you know, it's fairly easy to get money to build a church. People love to go throw money into building a church. We go, you know, Noah, under Noah's guidance, we go, we're building the church as we're preaching, as we're teaching, as we're witnessing to our friends. That's the building of the church. That's the hard work of building the church, rather than throw money at a building and then, you know, there it stands, and yet, you know, the next generation doesn't get it. So, but the other point about the pantheon of gods, that started in Babylon, and in their worship center with Marduk as their chief god, probably, you know, Nimrod trying to enshrine himself and trying to make himself the chief of the gods. That pattern of gods and the pantheon of gods repeats itself in Greece, in Rome, in the other nations that are all around, and you see that a very similar pattern of gods in Egypt and India, a very similar pattern of gods and goddesses that they're basically they're supermen and superwomen, and they have conflicts, and yet they have conflicts at that, you know, superlative kind of level, but they all have the foibles and the sins of men in them, but that pantheon of gods is still, you know, something to look back on. So it is the ambition and the pride, the contempt of God that is then showing through here as they make this building and as they build this particular city. The unifying pattern is the speech. So that's where God is going to come down and end up confounding their language. There's some indication here that the building's already being built, that and they continue on up, and then God comes down. So then you get the dispersion of all of the people groups, and you still have the building as a monument, not to what they wanted it to be. They couldn't make a name for themselves. God's going to make a name for themselves. He's going to point back to Babel, and he's going to go, look at that building. Now, if you want to go worship, look at the emptiness of it. Look at what God waves his hand. All of the languages come in. The confusion that is what Babel means. And now the dispersal that happens. They wouldn't disperse, so God supernaturally interfered and came in and dispersed them. Not because they wanted to be dispersed, but because that was the plan of God, to go out into all of the world to fill it. So now they're going to do it unwillingly. Calvin describes the condition as you think about the confusion of the language that happens when God goes down and confuses their language. You have the foreman saying to the workers, do this. And they're going, what are you talking about? And him emphasizing, do this. Now you have the workman going, the foreman is making fun of me again. He's saying something different. You know, he's saying, he's just ridiculing me. And what do you have? Obviously you have conflict because people cannot communicate. The unity that they had in the language, in the culture, in their desire to build a building and to make a name for themselves. Now God answers all of those. He disperses them. They get a name, but it is a name that is held in contempt throughout the rest of biblical history, throughout redemptive history. And we remember the Tower of Babel not as union, not as unity, but as confusion. And so it's interesting that every place that man says, we want to do this, let us do this, God comes in and interferes with that plan and redirects it to the plan of God. There's obviously some lessons there. So all of the plans of man then about trying to unify against God end up failing. And Noah has said that whenever the government organizes against the Church of God, you can anticipate that bad things are going to happen. And that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing a government that is a whole system of people that is organized against God. And the interesting thing to bring this kind of full circle, okay, Pete, you get the pièce de résistance, since we're using French. Acts 2, 1 through 11. That's Ben and Amanda. I was just repeating what they said.
Just showing.
That's our contribution to the.
Nice, nice.
2, 1 through 11.
1 through 11. Yep.
When the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place, and suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as of fire appeared to them and rested on each one of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound the multitude came together, and they were bewildered because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. And they were amazed and astonished, saying, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in his own native language? Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians. We hear them telling in our own tongues the mighty works of God."
Okay? So the dispersion that had to happen because the people organized against God, God had to interfere with that plan with the introduction of other languages. Now, in the gospel is brought full circle. And in the gospel, you have that unity again. So you have the kind of the restoration, if you will, of the common tongue of the gospel as the gospel goes out into all the world. So, let's see. Calvin, he has proclaimed one gospel in all languages through the whole world and has endued the apostles with the gift of tongues, whence it has come to pass that they who before were miserably divided have coalesced in the unity of faith. Very good way to put that. The division that happened as a result of the languages then ends up being the unity that happens in the gospel.
It's an amazing example of God turning back the curse.
Mm-hmm.
Really, that is from Genesis in Christ.
I actually anticipated somebody saying in the middle of class, "What about Pentecost?" But actually, I thought you were going to.
We were patiently waiting, so it's not still.
Very good, very good.
If you had missed it, we would have pounced on you.
It was a test. It was a test.
But you said curse is interesting that there isn't the same type of cursing language here as there is in other parts, up until this point, which the effect is to, it's more the effect of man, but it's not necessarily labeled as a curse from God. That last part.
That's a great point, and it's so the language, the presence of other languages, then actually becomes a blessing because it prevents men getting together and organizing against God.
Well, that last section of verse 4, it says, "Lest we be dispersed over the face of the earth." Not only was this a unifying effort, it was a direct defiance to God's direct command to go and fill the earth. So it was more than just, we're going to do this for unification. We're going to do this to stick it to God and say, you can't disperse us. But you didn't talk about it all today, but sort of the anthropomorphic language that is used here. Like, why is the author saying, hey, let's go look at this. Is God not omniscient? Well, of course he is.
Mhm.
And sort of the concept that throughout the Bible, God's, the anthropomorphic usage of investigation precedes divine judgment. In the sense that, hey, let's go look and see what these guys are doing. Well, he doesn't have to go down there and look. He knows,
There's also an insult. Let us go down and see this little tower.
Let's give her a look. Oh, well, and I was thinking, when you talk about Pentecost, to roll it out, because there's a now and a not yet, there's the passage in Philippians that says that at the name of Jesus, everyone will bow, and it has this language of every tribe, every tongue, every nation. I mean, there's that looking forward. Pentecost is just like a down payment. It's a taste, and then there's this looking forward to the fact that we're going to be unified.
Mhm.
All of humanity will.
To the city that comes.
Yeah.
Yep. City will come down instead of going up. Maybe that's the
Very good. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your work in this world. We thank you, Father, for the work of the gospel that unifies your church under one banner, that we might all worship you and praise you to your glory. Father, work in us saving faith, work in us the plan that you have set about to accomplish the glorifying of your great name and bringing people to yourself. In Christ's name, amen.
other interesting thing that has just the sense that I go under people, even Christians, that want to overemphasize the power of evil and to perseverate on it.